Good evening. Welcome, everyone. We're really grateful that you're here. I'm Stephanie Summers, the CEO of the Center for Public Justice. We're based in Washington, D.C. We're grateful for each of you who's here this evening in the room. We're also grateful for our guests who are joining us by live stream tonight, and folks who are watching the video later. I do want to extend my gratitude to Michael Watson, who leads the Henry Institute here at Calvin University, and also to Kylie Boss, who has helped coordinate all of the details to make this evening happen. So thank you for everything that you've done. This is the 7th time that we've partnered CPJ's Kuyper Lecture within the Henry Symposium, and is a partnership that I remain profoundly grateful for. Tonight, we're also joined by some past Kuyper lecturers, as well as CPJ's Board of Trustees, who are looking forward to connecting with symposium attendees during the breaks and meals during that event over the next couple of days. Our agenda for this evening is fairly simple and straightforward. I will make a few minutes of remarks to provide context for our lecture. I will briefly introduce our lecturer and then our discussants. We'll hear from Hans-Martien Napel as our 27th annual Kuyper Lecturer, and our discussants will make brief follow-up remarks, and then the four of us will have an onstage conversation. We'll move to a time of moderated questions from you, so if you think as you are going along of questions you would like to ask, there will be a time for that. And tonight's discussion is followed by a dessert reception. We'd be delighted if you would join us for dessert and conversation after the lecture in the room directly behind us. So on to context. The Center for Public Justice is a nonpartisan, Christian, civic education, and public policy organization based in Washington, D.C. We seek to inspire and equip Christians to pursue a common calling to faithful citizenship and to affirm the vital role of government in upholding public justice. Our annual Kuyper Lecture is named for Abraham Kuyper, an influential Dutch scholar-statesman whose many contributions to public life influence Christians today. Kuyper believed that the Christian life cannot be confined to church life, and accepting Christ's claim of authority over the entire world, he sought to follow the implications of the Christian faith into politics, journalism, the university, and other human endeavors. In this evening's Kuyper Lecture, titled In Search of the Radical Middle, Navigating Populism and Progressivism, you will hear themes informed by Kuyper's life and practice. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to our lecturer, Hans-Martien Napel. He is an associate professor of constitutional and administrative law at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Before transferring to the law school, he taught at the Institute for Political Science of the Faculty of Social Sciences at Leiden. He was a postdoctoral fellow for the Center for European Studies at Harvard University, and he served as a research fellow in legal studies at the Center for Theological Inquiry in Princeton, New Jersey, participating in an interdisciplinary research project entitled Law and Religious Freedom. As a fruit of his fellowship, he published the monograph Constitutionalism, Democracy, and Religious Freedom, To Be Fully Human, which is published by Routledge. For many years, he has been a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Religion, Law, and Policy, and since 2021, he has also been a senior fellow at the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy, serving on the Executive Editorial Council for the journal. Welcome, Hans-Martien.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction and indeed for the invitation to speak tonight. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here, meeting old friends again and making new ones. And I'm also grateful that the invitation allows me to connect the various strands of my scholarly work over time. The last time I was on this campus was exactly 25 years ago this year, from June 17 to 1999. I attended the second National Conference of Christians in Political Science, and I presented a paper at that conference entitled "The Fall of Christian Democracy in Europe." And that topic had to do with the topic of my dissertation, which was called "A Path of Our Own, the Formation of the Christian Democratic Appeal," the Dutch Christian Democratic Party. And my dissertation dealt with the complex negotiations between the Dutch Catholic People's Party, the Kuyperian Anti-Revolutionary Party, and the Christian Historical Union concerning a possible merger. Now, today's lecture again focuses on a possible path of our own for Christian political reflection. In the 1960s and 1970s, which I studied for my dissertation, that possible path of our own concerned the search for a radical middle ground between socialism and liberalism, conservative liberalism, that is. This time, the search is for a radical middle between progressivism and populism. Progressivism, or social liberalism, can be seen as an amalgamation of the former socialism and conservative liberalism. Now, that would have been no surprise to Kuyper. Kuyper had already distinguished between, and I quote, three national types that vie for dominance in the bosom of our nation. And in addition to the Roman Catholic and the Puritan Protestant types, this concerned the revolutionary type, according to Kuyper, whose ideal and type are found in the mode states of the French or German doctrinaries. In retrospect, it seems the political supporters of the French Revolution only temporarily split into a liberal current that emphasized more freedom and a socialist current that emphasized more equality. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, liberalism initially seemed to have remained the only significant political current. And indeed, in the battle of ideas with liberalism in recent decades, socialism has largely shed its ideological feathers, as a former Labour Party leader in the Netherlands said in 1995. And in doing so, socialism has fallen prone to what is sometimes called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a term that is used to describe the transformation of society due to market-based reforms. 35 years after the fall of the wall, however, liberalism seems to have changed character because its emphasis is now less on freedom and more on equality. Several years ago, a Leiden colleague of mine suggested that the apparent loser within the revolutionary movement, that is socialism, may have emerged as the winner. In his view, socialism has taken over liberalism from within. The conclusion is thus warranted that the former supporters of the French Revolution, which had split into liberals and socialists in the middle of the 19th century, have coalesced back into the single current of the early 19th century. An internal struggle occurs within this single current, as in Christian thought, between Catholics and Protestants. Regardless, it's understandable that opposition to this revolutionary thinking has once again grown among the population. Unlike in Kuyper's time, however, this opposition no longer comes primarily from Christian quarters. For that, the cultural revolution of the 1960s and the surge in secularization it set in motion has now made too deep a mark. Populism most clearly articulates discontent, and it thus immediately becomes clear that this current can hardly be valued only negatively. After all, a de facto one-party state with a single current in which socialism and liberalism have merged once again, a de facto one-party state is not ideal from a democratic point of view. At the same time, populism essentially also belongs to what Kuyper called the revolutionary type. David Koyzis, in his book Political Visions and Illusions, a survey and Christian critique of contemporary ideologies, does not use the term populism so much, but it comes close, I believe, to what he calls democratism. That is, democracy, not as a structure, but as a creed. And he speaks of, I quote, a belief in the near infallibility of the vox populi, the voice of the people. And hence the title of this lecture, In Search of the Radical Middle, Navigating Populism and Progressivism. After this introduction, I'd first like to further clarify the challenges of both progressivism and populism before outlining a possible direction for a solution. The name Radical Middle is not only the title of a collection of explorations of post-liberalism that I co-edited in 2021. It may also, as I hope to make plausible, serve as a contemporary label for the neo-Calvinist pursuit of public justice, especially if, more emphatically than in the past, government promotion of the common good becomes an integral part of it. Meanwhile, the title of my 1999 paper mentioned earlier, The Fall of Christian Democracy in Europe, referred to a book published 3 years earlier entitled The Rise of Christian Democracy in Europe. And the concluding sentence of my 1999 paper read, if the analysis presented in this paper is correct, it probably will not be long until that book, The Rise of Christian Democracy in Europe, is followed by a study of the fall of Christian democracy in Europe. Now, though I don't dare to claim that I possess predictive powers, it should be noted that at the time of the presentation in 1999, the Dutch Christian Democratic Appeal still held 29 out of 150 seats in the Dutch House of Representatives. That was 5 fewer than in 1994, when the party suffered a historic loss of 20 seats and fell from 54 to 34. Resulting in the first cabinet without the participation of Christian parties since 1918. Now in 2024, only 5 seats remain of the 29 seats the Christian Democratic Appeal held in 1999. So, I was curious as to what had prompted my pessimistic analysis 25 years ago. I looked up that paper. I still had it somewhere, my bookcase. And it turns out, the explanation turns out to have been the lack of conviction which characterizes both its, that is, of European Christian democracy, current leadership, and its electorate. And on the European level at the time, this manifested itself, for example, in the strategy of openness pursued by the European People's Party towards conservative parties in EU member states in which no authentic Christian democratic party existed. I contrasted this lack of conviction with, as his biographer George Pushinger had convincingly demonstrated, the central event in Kuyper's life being his conversion, so to say, to Orthodox Protestantism. In his first Stone lecture, entitled Calvinism, a Life System, Kuyper argued that two life systems are wrestling with one another in mortal combat. I'm quoting now. Modernism is bound to build a world of its own from the data of the natural man and to construct man himself from the data of nature, while on the other hand, all those who reverently bend the knee to Christ and worship him as the Son of the living God and God himself are bent upon saving the Christian heritage. This, Kuyper said, is the struggle in America, and this also is the struggle for principles in which my own country is engaged and in which I myself have been spending all my energy for nearly 40 years. The principle of sphere sovereignty played an essential role in that struggle, Kuyper's struggle. It was described by Kuyper as the principle, I quote, that the family, the business, science, art, and so forth are all social spheres which do not owe their existence to the state and which do not derive the law of their life from the superiority of the state, but obey a high authority within their own bosom, an authority which rules by the grace of God, just as the sovereignty of the state does. As Peter Haslam rightly noted, this principle of sphere sovereignty provided the rationale for social and political pluralism, which was Kuyper's answer to the liberal domination of politics in his time. This principled pluralism, as it's called, especially since the constitutional reform of 1917 that included the financial equality of public and private education, has been the prevailing model of church-state relations in the Netherlands for the better part of the 20th century. As Stanley Carlson Thies wrote in his dissertation, by the 1930s, state policy for dealing with the multiple fundamental convictions of how private and public activities ought to be carried out had been transformed. Equality of treatment no longer was understood to require the state to ignore philosophical differences, but rather to embrace them. The liberal public order had been transformed into what we might call a pluriform public order, with rules and structures designed to incorporate the array of fundamental convictions even into the very services for which the state assumed responsibility. By 1999, however, this pluriform public order was again under considerable pressure. At least that's what I argued during the annual meeting of the American Political Science Association, which took place in September of that same year in Atlanta. I presented a paper there on the changing relationship between church and state in Europe. And my audience included the late Stephen Monsma, whom I visibly disappointed. Professor Monsma published a comparative book on the challenge of pluralism 2 years earlier. And one of his motives for writing that book was to present to Americans the Dutch model of principled pluralism as an alternative to the strict separation of church and state. However, I argued that as international interest in that model was growing, as evidenced by the book and indeed by the case law of the US Supreme Court at the time, it had unmistakably passed its peak in the Netherlands. And guess what? The American model of strict separation of church and state was taking its place. Now, once again, I don't want to suggest that I possess predictive powers. Nevertheless, a dissertation defended at the University of Amsterdam just last month, titled From Liberty to Equality, is worth mentioning. Because that dissertation demonstrates, as the title suggests, that, and I quote, historically, equality in various forms has increasingly influenced the relationship between church and state in the Netherlands. Parliamentary debates on the General Equal Treatment Act in 1985, 1993, and 2014 illustrate how parties are compelled to reason within a framework of equality. Even parties that were once staunch opponents of that General Equal Treatment Act, such as the Reformatory Political Federation and the Reformed Political Alliance, later merged into the Christian Union, and the Political Reformed Party. We have quite a few Reformed parties in the Netherlands. We used to have quite a few Reformed parties in the Netherlands. Even those parties, the author of this dissertation writes, are being swept along in this tide of equality thinking. Now, some explanation is required here. After all, principal pluralism, as we saw, has precisely equality of treatment at stake. This recent thesis, however, is concerned with what Kuyper would call the modern form of egalitarian thinking, which threatens social and political pluralism. And thus, to a certain extent, we are back in the liberal public order of the 19th century, against the background of which Kuyper had developed his doctrine of sphere sovereignty. Todd Huizinga, a former fellow here at the Henry Institute and currently senior fellow for Europe at the Religious Freedom Institute, Todd Huizinga has made a connection between the totalitarian tendencies he, together with Polish Catholic post-liberal Ryszard Legutko and others, perceives in contemporary liberal democracy, and Kuyper's great Dutch predecessor, Guillaume Groen van Prinsterer. Now, Legutko is Polish, and he has lived under hard totalitarianism imposed by the former Soviet Union. So he knows what totalitarianism means. Nevertheless, Legutko regards soft totalitarianism as well. And here I'll briefly summarize Legutko's book on the totalitarian temptations in free societies in Huizinga's words for clarity. Like communism, Legutko writes, like communism, contemporary Western liberal democracy, especially in Western Europe, is about transforming the world. It is progressive. It is animated by the fight against the forces of backwardness and the rejection of the commitments of religion, social morality, and tradition. Next, Huizinga quotes Groen van Prinsterer himself, whose central thesis is outlined in Lecture 8 of his 1847 book, Unbelief and Revolution, where Groen van Prinsterer writes, "The revolution, with its variety of schools of thought and its successive historical manifestation, is the consequence, the application, the unfolding of unbelief. Atheism in religion and radicalism in politics are not only not the exaggeration, misuses, or distortion, but in fact the consistent and faithful application of a principle which sets aside the God of revelation in favor of the supremacy of reason. Where unbelief is free to run its natural course in religion and politics," Groen writes, it cannot but lead to the most radical doctrines. And in response to this quote, Todd Huizinga says, though the term would not be used until the 1920s, a half century after Groen's death, what Groen calls radicalism or absolutism is in fact totalitarianism. Moreover, in describing the totalitarian impetus of liberal democracy in the European Union and its member states, Legutko carries Groen's thought into the 21st century. And, Huizinga writes, he is proving to be as prophetic as Groen van Prinsterer. Now, to support this striking assertion, Huizinga then cites Rizal Legutko himself when the latter writes that everything that exists in society must become liberal democratic over time and be imbued with the spirit of the system. Not only should the state and the economy be liberal, democratic, or liberal democratic, but the entire society as well, including ethics and morals, family, churches, schools, universities, community organizations, culture, and human sentiments and aspirations. And the people, structures, thoughts that exist outside the liberal democratic pattern are deemed outdated, backward-looking, useless, but at the same time extremely dangerous as preserving the remnants of the old authoritarianisms. As a result, Legutko writes, liberal democracy has become an all-permeating system, a totalitarian system. Now, as you see, this is the very opposite of sphere sovereignty. Like Groen, Legutko seeks the cause of this totalitarian or at least totalizing tendency of liberal democracy in unbelief. Moreover, those of you who might believe that this phenomenon occurs only in Europe will be deceived. As Huizinga remarks, Legutko's description of atheist liberal democracy in Europe is an increasingly apt characterization of American democracy as well. Now, as noted earlier, it is hardly surprising, and on the contrary, I would even say encouraging, that opposition to this trend arises. Nor is it surprising, given the cultural revolution of the 1960s, that this opposition is taking a different form than that of Kuyper in the 19th century. In a time of unbelief, it would explain the resurgence of populism. This opposition, this populist opposition, does not focus on church-state relations, like the neo-Calvinist opposition of the past. The principal pluralism advocated by neo-Calvinists does not square well with the populist emphasis on the unity of the imaginary people who oppose the equally imaginary hostile elite. And this is already an important reason, I would say, to also keep a distance from populism. Moreover, as I argued elsewhere, social and political pluralism can be considered a prerequisite for a thriving and resilient constitutional democracy. And consequently, populism is as much a threat to constitutional democracy as progressivism. That said, populism at its best, can provide a healthy counterbalance to progressivism in other areas, perhaps primarily in the socio-economic field, where progressivism, as we have already seen, has fallen under the spell of neoliberalism in recent decades. Liberalism in general, and neoliberalism in particular, is characterized by its view that, as David Koyzis concisely puts it, there is no common good. And that logically leads to the idea, and I'm quoting Koyzis again, of a spiritually vacant state, which, of course, gives the liberal ideology a religious character of its own. Gabriel van der Brink, professor of philosophy at the Free University in Amsterdam, said in an interview on March 13th of this year that our civilization is under pressure, for that civilization is based on a balance of power, market, and morality. But for decades, there was a liberal policy that was only about the market and power. Secularization discredited the morality of policy. That was private. For Sundays, you do that at home, end of quote. In an analysis consistent with this diagnosis, the chairman of the Social and Economic Council and former director of the Netherlands Institute for Social Research, Kim Putters, who in his capacity as a so-called informateur in February and March of this year examined the possibilities of forming a new cabinet in the Netherlands, in an analysis consistent with this diagnosis, Kim Putters writes that, I quote, different groups of citizens, not only people in vulnerable positions, are experiencing a greater distance from the political system. For some time, the political and social debate has discussed the persistent differences between groups of citizens. Now, differences have always existed between people, and in a democracy there is room for diversity. However, Kim Putters writes, if those differences lead to deficits in disposable income, education, access to social networks, housing and health, this can reinforce perceived injustice and polarization. More and more people now no longer see the government as part of the solution to problems, but rather as their cause. Overall, there is thus a crisis of authority or legitimacy. And populism is the symptom rather than the cause of that crisis. And that also means that attempts to make democracy more resilient, for example, by systematically excluding populist parties from government corporations or even banning them, will not help. Instead, these attempts exacerbate the legitimacy crisis insofar as voters vote for these populist parties precisely to express their dissatisfaction. Moreover, when it comes to more cultural issues such as gender, immigration, climate change, and Europe or internationalization, these parties regularly offer welcome corrections to progressive positions. Yet the confusing part of the situation is that populist parties in turn can reinforce the legitimacy crisis through their sometimes unconstitutional views. And in a recent contribution, I characterized claims made after the Dutch 2017 House of Representatives elections, in which the right-wing Populist Party for Freedom still finished second, that Dutch democracy is in better shape than ever. I characterized those claims as dancing on the deck of the Titanic. Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom is now the largest party by far. And the critical question then is what can be done to prevent Western democracy from definitively becoming a sinking ship? And what Christian, and in particular neo-Calvinist, political reflection can contribute to this. And that brings me to the final part of my presentation. Now, the good news is that no serious doubt exists as to the direction for a solution. And that is to strengthen the acceptability of governmental action, we must together regain a notion of what the common good holds in the present and then further it. This and only this can end the unwholesome polarization in which two groups stand, or believe they stand, against each other, here and in Europe. Given the cultural development that has taken place since the 1960s, the good news is also that this is not an exclusively Christian notion. Throughout history, the criterion for distinguishing good from bad political regimes has been whether or not they advanced the common good. That determined legitimacy. So, if we are to restore legitimacy, we must work on that as well. And this idea has, of course, been around since Aristotle, and it received further impetus under the influence of Thomas Aquinas, who lived well before the Reformation and can thus be regarded as the common doctor. For Aquinas, a law was an ordinance of reason for the common good. In other words, if a law does not further the common good, there is no law at all. Recently, the notion of the common good has been returned to more frequently. For example, Oxford constitutional theorist Benjamin Barber writes in Aristotelian fashion about the purpose of the state being, and I quote, to promote the well-being of all citizens, not just a portion of them. And in his book, Common Good Constitutionalism, Harvard professor of constitutional law Adrian Vermeule advocates a paradigm shift in replacing liberal constitutionalism with common good constitutionalism. Now, some authors, including good friends of mine, associate that with authoritarianism or even fascism. But there is no reason for that at all based on this book. It is a post-liberal book, not an integralist one, if you know that term. Otherwise, I can explain it later. It's a post-liberal book since it instructs the state to promote earthly general welfare and not eternal salvation. That is, in fact, an explanation of what integralism would be if the state wants to secure eternal salvation for all of us as well. But common good constitutionalism is not about that. It's about the earthly general welfare. And therefore, I would say that there is much to be said for a paradigm shift, for a regime change. As liberal constitutionalism, consistent with what Legutko has argued, is becoming increasingly coercive. For example, two leading public lawyers recently claimed that, I quote, protection of gender equality, reproductive freedoms, LGBTQ rights, and the right to die with dignity are considered some of the hallmarks of the current liberal constitutional rights jurisprudence. In other words, any system that does not recognize all these rights then quickly becomes unconstitutional. A more relevant discussion, it seems to me, is how the state's responsibility to promote the common good relates to the core Protestant concept of the state's role, namely public justice. Traditionally, the principle of sphere sovereignty mentioned earlier has been central to this. And in his 2017 Kuyper Lecture, Dr. Charles Glenn deemed revitalization of that notion, that principle of sphere sovereignty, necessary in the age of Trump. Now, it is crucial to avoid caricatures. For example, it would be entirely incorrect to argue that in Catholic social teaching, in which the promotion of the common good is central, this task would belong exclusively to the state. Conversely, it is equally wrong to think that Protestants have no regard for the promotion of the common good, or see no role for the state in it. However, it is notable that Professor Wolterstorff, when he devoted his Paul B. Henry lecture here in 2022 to hallmarks of Christian political activity in the tradition of Reformed Protestantism, made virtually no reference to the common good. And questioned on this by Paul Whiteman, professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, Professor Wolterstorff admitted that what he said about the common good was, I quote, brief and unemphatic, easily overlooked. And he continued, Professor Wolterstorff continued, I didn't know Professor Wolterstorff would be in the room, otherwise I might have skipped this passage. But Professor Wolterstorff continued, I quote, maybe the idea is there in neo-Calvinism without the term. Consider Kuyper's idea of sphere sovereignty. Is that not a particular take on the common good? Different from Whiteman's, from the Catholic one, certainly. But if it is not a take on a common good, what is it? Politics, says Whiteman, should aim at making conditions of temporal flourishing available. Kuyper argued at length that the condition of temporal flourishing is that activity in one social sphere does not dominate activity in another, end of quote. Now, I can agree with that to a large extent. However, I think it is a little bit of an example of circular reasoning. After all, the common good then becomes virtually synonymous with sphere sovereignty. The thesis I want to defend today is that the role of government in promoting the common good should become a more prominent part of the neo-Calvinist concept of public justice. Dr. Glenn indicated in his 2017 Kuyper Lecture that he sees the administrative state as a threat to pluralism. After all, the government, as Kuyper also stressed, can emanate an urge for uniformity. That is true, because the administrative state is currently driven by a progressive ethos. However, what if a more radical middle-inspired, non-ideological, as David Koyzis would say, ethos were to take its place? Moreover, it is not easy to imagine that our current significant challenges can be adequately addressed without an essential, more than classically liberal role for the state. James Skillen rightly wrote as early as 1990 that the political order performs a public integrating function and not merely a protective differentiating function for individuals and institutions in society. Therefore, he wrote, a political order is a commonwealth, a political community, and the task of government is to guard the commons, to uphold the commonwealth. Jonathan Chaplin, in his book on Herman Dooyeweerd, has an interesting 10th chapter entitled An Active, Limited State. Active, limited state. And in that chapter, he proposes an important clarification of the meaning of public justice that, and I quote him, opens the door to a fruitful interchange with the Catholic notion of the common good. Now, that is something that I envisage in this lecture as well. In the Netherlands, the discussion about where the center of gravity in promoting the common good should lie was conducted within Christian democracy after the merger came into being, and similar discussions are occurring within the originally Protestant Christian Union Party, which has become more open to Catholic social teaching in recent years. But the issue is thorny, which is illustrated by the fact that these discussions have not been able to stem the decline of the Christian democratic appeal, and more recently also the Christian Union. Key to this has been, I believe, an insufficiently critical eye for the influence of progressivism, as defined above, on their stances regarding issues like gender, immigration, climate change, and Europe, not concerning the state's responsibility to promote the common good. As mentioned earlier, the search for the radical middle between populism and progressivism is anything but sectarian. Thus, thanks to what Kuyper calls common grace, freedom and equality, the ideals of progressivism, need by no means be jettisoned entirely. As J.K. Chesterton wrote, the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. The remedy of the radical middle in neo-Calvinist circles amounts to a reversal of order from public justice in the form of sphere sovereignty, in the hope that it indirectly promotes the common good, to public justice in the form of more direct advancement of the common good by government, subject to sphere sovereignty. That, I believe, is public justice 2.0. I want to close this lecture by making just a couple of remarks about whether this public justice 2.0 can be realized. After all, whether it can be realized. So, can you have direct promotion of the common good by the government subject to sphere sovereignty? Can that be done? Now, I think whether that it can be done. Whether this can be done is not a question for me. After all, it was done by European Christian democracy in the first decades after World War II. And that is why classical Christian democracy is held up as a model by contemporary British post-liberals, such as Labour peer Maurice Glasman, Conservative MP Danny Kruger, and Professor of Political Science at the University of Kent, Adrian Pabst. The question of whether Christian democracy can be imported from Europe is also being raised in the United States. And for example, one could think of the American Solidarity Party, where post-liberals Patrick Deneen and Susanna Black-Roberts are among the advisors. Within classical Christian democracy, there has always been room for pro-welfare policies, although Protestant parties did indeed initially struggle with this. Furthermore, what is needed to prevent it from having a unifying effect is to reconnect the application and exercise of rights more closely to the idea of the common good. That way, the natural rights of religion, expression, and association would regain their rightful place, and the principles of subsidiarity, the Catholic version of sphere sovereignty, and solidarity will then do the rest. Finally, for the search for a radical middle between populism and progressivism to succeed, the common good must regain its central place in the various forms of international cooperation. and that means standing up for both the natural and the social environment. Pope Francis calls this an integral ecology. Only in this way will both national and international legal orders be able to regain and deserve legitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans-Martien. I'd like to move to our discussants, and I'm going to invite you to hear remarks from Ruth Melkonian-Hoover first, followed immediately by David Koyzis. So I'm going to introduce them both so there's not a back and forth interruption. Professor Melkonian-Hoover is a professor in the political science department at Gordon College in Wenham, Massachusetts, and has a Ph.D. from Emory University. With Lyman Kelstedt, she recently co-authored Evangelicals and Immigration, Fault Lines Among the Faithful. She's published in Social Science Quarterly, The Review of Faith and International Affairs, Latin American Perspectives, and Political Research Quarterly, as well as Welcoming the Stranger in Cosmologics and a Theology of Immigrant Labor in Comment. Her scholarly interests include Latin America, immigration, women and politics, religion, and international affairs. And she is currently in an active research project on religion and immigration in the United States. She'll be followed by David Koyzis, who is currently a global scholar with the Global Scholars Canada organization, holds a PhD in government and international studies from the University of Notre Dame, and he's the author of Political Visions and Illusions, as well as We Answer to Another, Authority, Office, and the Image of God, and a forthcoming book, Citizenship Without Illusions, A Christian Guide to Political Engagement, to be published by InterVarsity and released in November. So, Ruth, please join us.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Dr. Napel. So I appreciate your excellent overview of the decline of Christian democracy in Europe, the growing polarization between progressives and populists in Europe and the US, and the need for a new radical middle that prioritizes the common good by government subject to sphere sovereignty. There's much good work to consider and engage here. So my remarks and questions reveal that I'm not a political philosopher, but a political scientist, one who's studied some of these questions in the US and Latin America. And I will note at the start, I am asking too many questions, so just pick and choose as you see fit in terms of what you feel like fielding. So let me start with a question about your overarching thesis. I'm sure it's a question that many of us have, even when we want to hold on to hope. You foresaw or predicted the decline of Christian democracy in Europe and laid out some of the external factors leading to such. Would not those same factors or variables thwart a renewed US or European effort toward the radical middle? There may be a middle in the population of the US, for example. I wish maybe it were more radical. Right now it feels silent, exhausted. It might be amenable to your proposal, but many in the middle seem to be checked out, maybe fed up with the rabid rhetoric of the far right and the far left. And I also have a definitional concern or just clarification. You discuss progressivism and populism as if they are polar opposites. However, in Latin America, the region is rife with left-wing progressive populists. As we know, Castro's in Cuba, Chavez historically in Venezuela, Ortega in Nicaragua historically, Lula in Brazil, AMLO in Mexico, and so on. Are you solely referencing right-wing populism? And of course, in the North, we also have plenty of leftist anti-internationalist populists who fear global cooperation and multinational corporations. But staying with Latin America, you are understandably critical of the tendency of progressive liberalism to subsume governance, society, and so on. But thinking again of Latin America, as Peter Berger and others have noted, Peter Berger changing his opinion markedly in this regard, unlike those who presumed liberalism's secularizing tendencies Haven't liberalism and modernity married quite nicely with faith and tradition in Latin America as of late, leading to increased space for religious pluralism and notably the rise of Pentecostalism there? So could liberalism continue to be reformed to be more pluralism friendly, offering that equality of treatment for all, as you note, and much needed checks and balances? And as for spheres outside of governance, I also wonder if liberalism is as overweening as some of those you cite contest that it is. Today, are families forced to make children equal to parents in responsibility and authority in the Western world? I would say there have been some shifts in that regard in the area of children's rights, but parents are still presumed to be guardians of children, and they are still held to account when they are neglectful parents, for example. Moving to questions of populism, you do note populism is problematic on many fronts, but highlight that at least it pushes back against totalitarian tendencies of progressivism and presses for a diversity of viewpoints, or at least inclusion of its viewpoints. And yet, as you note, it has anti-constitutional tendencies, something that we see growing on the far left in the US, with a concern that our Constitution is irrevocably tainted given the racism of its time, and by the far right, with folks not happy about the limits of liberalism or the diminishment of its majority culture and religion, and would prefer more establishment. You do not also emphasize, I'm curious about what you think, and maybe would love to hear more about the intersection of religion and populism, and maybe the politicization of religion in this regard. So, and I'm thinking here more of the arguments of scholars like Tobias Kramer and the Godless Crusade and others who argue that while that populism in Europe may be more LGBTQ friendly and at times more secular than populism in the US, but both populism in Europe and the US have a tendency to use Christianity as an identity marker, as a veneer, not at its moral foundation. So you have a lot of folks who are belonging, maybe without believing. And I want to reference this because, of course, it has implications for religion as a foundation for these solutions that you propose, given today's problematic association of religion with populism on both continents, with an attendant tendency, therefore, to dismiss or reduce a range of efforts to bring religion into public life as simply part of a Christian nationalist movement. And there have been some good papers on that today in this regard. So, at this very conference, I should say. And I would say, look, it's very easy to critique the state of our world right now, but it's very difficult to offer solutions in these times, so thank you for offering some. And so I want to address some of those. In your conclusion, you do call for international cooperation and leadership, and you reference the Pope's encyclical on the environment, which prompts me to ask, do you think the Catholic Church of today and Pope Francis are helpful examples of the radical middle? Alan Hertzky says they're kind of equiposed between tradition and modernity. And I do like your reference to the example of the American Solidarity Party, a new Christian Democratic Party in the US, which I admit I was unfamiliar with, though it has been around since 2016, but has had very localized success, right? Winning some seats in local government on school boards. But could you offer other comparable examples in the US and Europe, maybe a specific, maybe in particular, a specific and more practical example of a government policy behavior that would look different under Public Justice 2.0 than Public Justice 1.0? And then if you could also further, when you have time, we can have this conversation late in the night. Could you expand on the role of the state in advancing the common good? Similar to Charles Glenn's concerns, I worry about places like Singapore where the state determines what the common good is and how spheres will enforce it. Does your approach offer enough protection for dissenters, for minorities? However, I do concur with you that some advocates of principled pluralism have given the state short shrift, so I appreciate your emphasis on its role in public justice as being crucial. And I thank you for pushing these ideas out in your work and complicating the landscape. And I thank the Center for Public Justice in its role for already undertaking and prioritizing much of this work within civil society.
I want to start by affirming that based on this address, I believe that Professor Napel and I are very much kindred spirits. We both find our spiritual roots in the neo-Calvinist movement in his homeland and stand in the anti-revolutionary tradition of Guillaume Groen van Prinsterer and Abraham Kuyper. Moreover, I sympathize with Napel's efforts to reclaim a radical middle. I have sometimes described myself, tongue-in-cheek, as a fanatical moderate, perhaps an appropriate label for a citizen of a country that once had a progressive conservative party at the federal level. But given my American birth, I have continuing concerns about the political health of the United States. I have lived in Canada for nearly 4 decades, but when our family has traveled to the States in recent years, I cannot escape the feeling that we are spending time in an increasingly foreign country. It is not the same country that I left behind in 1987. Everything changes, of course, and not all change represents decline or loss. Nevertheless, the political culture in the United States has not noticeably improved during my absence and may have deteriorated. I have noticed 5 major developments. Number 1, increased political polarization. 2, a decline in respect for ordinary political institutions and procedures within which our representatives can air their differences. 3, one party seeming support for demagogues' ambitions over the rule of law. 4, the other party's apparent willingness to buy into a quasi-Marxist division of society into oppressors and oppressed. And 5, the relative absence of the sorts of Christian legislators in the 2 chambers of Congress whom I so admired in my youth. And I'm thinking of people like Senator Mark Hatfield and Senator Paul Simon from my home state of Illinois, and Stephen Monsma, who once taught here at Calvin. Where are these people? The polarization in Congress in particular threatens its ability to act at all, much less to legislate for the good of the country as a whole. Of course, there has always been opposition between the 2 major parties, and this partisanship is one of the checks that is supposed to prevent leaders from accumulating too much power in their own hands. In Canada and other Westminster democracies, we have a long tradition of government and opposition, whereby the opposition parties perform a crucial monitoring role to keep the government in line. There is, of course, no government in opposition in the United States. Nevertheless, Republicans and Democrats historically functioned as checks on each other, even as they respected each other as valued colleagues. I don't believe it's an overstatement to observe that this mutual respect across partisan lines has declined to the point of nearly paralyzing Congress. Much of this polarization has been perpetuated by a dangerously dysfunctional dance between progressivism and populism. Progressivism is a composite ideology borrowing elements of liberalism, socialism, democratism, and sometimes even nationalism. It aims at transforming society for the purpose of reaching a particular goal, often liberty, equality, diversity, or inclusion, and is generally disinclined to tolerate those with more nuanced understandings of the relationship between principles and goals. Even those, such as the late British political scientist Sir Bernard Crick, who insists that politics modestly attempts to conciliate diversity peacefully, are likely to be dismissed by the most hardened progressives as insufficiently dedicated to the single-minded pursuit of whatever overriding goal they have fastened onto. Moreover, progressives have a habit of constantly moving the goalposts and then effectively excommunicating from their ranks those former progressives unable to go along with the latest addition to the progressive agenda. As the 18th century Genevan journalist Jacques Mallet Dupin famously put it, like Saturn, the revolution devours her children. Progressives claim to know where history is going, and thus bring into the political arena an unwarranted assumption that history is on their side, often labeling their opponents as retrogressive or bigoted, benighted, deplorable, or another negative epithet, without seeing the need to engage them in discussion over their latest proposals. In this respect, progressives tend towards dogmatism rather than openness to conversation with their opponents. At the moment, the current progressive dogmatism revolves largely around what I have called the choice enhancement state in my book, Political Visions and Illusions, or the conviction that freedom of choice is a good in itself, irrespective of the substantive content of people's choices. Charles Taylor and others have called this expressive individualism, which progressives identify altogether too closely with the protection of basic human rights. Populism has its roots in the United States at the end of the 19th century, when James B. Weaver stood for the presidency with the People's Party to protect the interests of Southern and Western farmers. Although the original populists made a series of demands intended to break the power of Eastern moneyed interests, more recent populists have capitalized on popular discontent with urban elites, which they identify with an educated class of affluent globalists willing to sell out the interests of the broad masses of their own fellow citizens for the sake of members of their own class in other countries. Much as Marx proclaimed that the working man has no country, so the global elite have no country, feeling equally at home in London, Paris, Toronto, Chicago, Tokyo, or Singapore. Now, populism is itself a global phenomenon, manifesting itself not only in Donald Trump's radically altered Republican Party, but also in Viktor Orban's Fidesz in Hungary, Jair Bolsonaro's Social Liberal Party in Brazil, Mateusz Morawiecki's Law and Justice Party in Poland, and Geert Wilders' Partij voor de Vrijheid in the Netherlands. Populism is less concerned with abstract principles of justice than with appealing to the resentments of a particular demographic that feels itself to have lost out to the country's globalizing elites. A common theme in all populist movements is fear of immigrants whose arrival might destabilize society and who might take jobs away from the native born. Populists tend to favor traditional religions, even if they themselves are not very devout. They suspect the reviled elites of being disloyal to the country and of ignoring the interests of ordinary folk like themselves. In declining industrial towns of the American Rust Belt, people have seen their jobs exported overseas and feel left behind by a globalized economy. These very conditions make populists uniquely vulnerable to would-be strongmen, promising to restore their country's greatness and to bring back the now vanished prosperity that they once enjoyed, or that perhaps their parents or grandparents once enjoyed. Ironically, like Marx and his followers, populists also tend to divide their societies between oppressors and oppressed, obviously placing themselves in the latter category. These developments make me sympathetic with Napel's search for an alternative to progressivism and populism. But whether radical middle or my vaunted fanatical moderatism is an appropriate label, I have reason to doubt. I would suggest that rather than trying to find a path between progressivism and populism, we need to locate norms that will enable us both to work to protect the multiple agents of a pluriform society and to get along with our fellow citizens in the midst of basic disagreements. We need, above all, to demonstrate our allegiance to the rule of law. We need to recommit ourselves to upholding and maintaining our common political institutions, which, after all, provide the context in which we can deliberate about matters of shared concern. We need as well to commit ourselves to listening as much as to talking. We need finally to make our preferred policy proposals with conviction, but also with modesty, recognizing that our political opponents may have insights which deserve to be heard and considered. Thank you.
Thanks to each of you for your remarks. You have been very patient, and I hope you have questions. I'm going to start us off with two while you think of your questions. When we get to questions, we're going to have Deborah on our team come up here at the microphone. We're going to ask you to come to the microphone. And my only rule for questions is please just ask a question in the form of a question. And if you could introduce yourself, even if it's just your first name, so our panelists know they're speaking to a human being, that would be fantastic. Okay, so to start, a significant thread in your account is how post-1960s secularism in the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe has led to a conflict not between church and state or Christians and secularism, but one between progressive educated elites and populist neglected communities. There seems to be a similar conflict in the United States, even though religious faith here continued to have culturally formative power into the 1990s and 2000s. Why the similar political ideological conflict when the religious secular division has been so different? I'll ask you to answer first, and if either of you want to weigh in as well.
Well, thank you very much for that question. It may seem like I have spoken more about the Netherlands and Europe than about the US, but as I see it, there is the same development taking place in both Europe and the United States. And that development is what a law professor, Stephen D. Smith, writes about in a book published a couple of years ago. Some of you may have read it. It's about a new paganism. The book is called Pagans and Christians in the City. Culture wars from the Tiber to the Potomac. And the Tiber refers back to Rome. And he sees parallels between different types of religion, beliefs in classical Rome and today. And the difference is that there is one group that sees the sacred within this world and so has an immanent perspective. And there's another group that searches for the sacred outside this world, and that is a transcendent perspective. And just like the Romans had difficulty with Christians way back in time and would not tolerate, so to say, that transcendent perspective, so progressives today have difficulty, although they are very much in favor of tolerance, they find it very difficult to tolerate people who wish to adhere to transcendent perspectives. And that phenomenon, that the return of that new paganism, as Stephen Smith calls it, that intolerance of transcendent perspectives, is taking place in the US and in Europe There's no difference. The only difference might be that perhaps the transcendent perspective, the representation of the transcendent perspectives has been slightly stronger here than in Europe until recently, but it is changing here as well. And so it's a difference in timing, in the stage that we're at. But the Potomac that Stephen D. Smith refers to is a river here in the United States and not in Europe, as far as I know. So it's here as well. And his book, actually, he turns the question around. He says, I will focus on the United States, where I see this conflict playing out. And you, reader, must judge for yourself whether you also see it in Europe. And I say, I recognize what he is describing in the United States, also in Europe, but again, he describes what's going on here. So it's a relative difference, not an absolute one, and that explains that we see the same kind of phenomena here and in Europe, across the Western world.
I've sometimes wondered whether we in North America are experiencing what Europe did perhaps 150 years ago. And some of the same trends that affected Europe, the sort of mass secularization of the society, is not in some ways making its way into Canada and the United States. And I think it's in some ways, but nevertheless, there's still some parallels, I think, between what's happening in the two continents. And I think it may be that the internet and social media have fueled some of that. We're not isolated from each other in the way that we were even a generation ago. I mean, we can go back to the 19th century, the telegraph, bound people together in a way that they had not been before. Then there was radio, television, various forms of communication, but the internet, instantaneously, you know what's happening on the other side of the world. I see what my relatives in Cyprus are doing, virtually every day over Facebook. And Ruth and I both have roots in Cyprus. My father and her father were classmates at the American Academy in Larnaca, Cyprus, about 75 and 80 years ago. So we have that in common. But the social media and the seeming inability of ordinary people to ferret out the truth from falsehoods. And I wonder if maybe the internet has become a huge rumor mill, and that the forces of secularization are riding on the coattails of the internet and this vast worldwide rumor mill. It's just speculation.
Well, and I would also just say, in terms of economically based populism in the US, that's been around for a while in terms of critique of the global elite and critique and concerns around globalization. And then there have been different waves in terms of cultural populism, right? But I think one thing that, again, some analysts are saying that's quite interesting in this front is that the nature of American populism, instead of the presumption is that the U.S. is exporting its form of populism everywhere, right? Brazil blames us for Bolsonaro, right, and Trump and phenomena. But it does look like Trump and some of his followers are copying European populists, right, in terms of some of the strategies being utilized and the concern around Islam and immigration being primary and emphasizing that more so than economic concerns even.
Thank you. All right, think of your question. I'm going to ask my last one. So you advocate for public justice 2.0, which is a very intriguing thesis, which would, as you said, press government to act more kind of aggressively in the promotion of the common good of everyone in society, while its action would be kept subject to sphere sovereignty or protecting the distinct roles of non-governmental institutions, by way of explanation. But as you know and say, sphere sovereignty stresses kind of a strong and an independent role for non-governmental organizations to make their own contributions to human flourishing based on their varied worldviews, while a larger government role seems like it might inevitably enlarge government and shrink civil society, and besides, to impose more and more uniformity. So could you give an example of how maybe a more vigorous common good government action can be combined with civil society vigor and a strong honoring of religious diversity?
Yes, that's the crucial question. I think that my presentation raises, and I've kept it abstract, and so now you ask me to make it more concrete. And I had expected a question like that either from you or from the audience. So there are two things I think I want to say. The common good, as the Catholic Church sees it, respects persons, so it's not a kind of collectivism. The Catholic social teaching is distinctive in that it emphasizes the common good, but not at the cost of individuals, and neither at the cost of groups, organizations. And so, should a pursuit of the common good violate sphere sovereignty, so to say, that would contravene the very idea, the very Catholic idea of the common good. It's incorporated. So I gave the example of a law, according to Aquinas, is only a law as long as it furthers the common good. So you can say here, the common good can only be furthered by the government, by the state, under the condition that sphere sovereignty is respected. That was my first remark. Second remark, closer to your question, an example. So what does the Catholic Church say about the common good, the contents? And I took a crash course on the Catechism of the Social Church last year, of the Catholic Church last year, because there's a podcast by Father Mike Schmitz. I don't know whether you've heard of him. It's a very popular podcast. He made first podcast was the Bible in a year, and the second was the Catechism in a year. And I listened to that podcast 365 days last year, including an explanation of the common good. And so what does the Catechism say and Catholic social doctrine say about the common good? It's about making accessible to each what is needed to lead a truly human life. That's what the Catechism literally says. Make accessible to each and all of us what is needed to lead a truly human life. Now, what are those things? Food, clothing, health, work, education, culture, suitable information, and so on. Those are a couple of examples that I mentioned. Now, if the subsidiarity principle means that if all these goods can be realized nationally here in the US and internationally, because there's also a universal common good, if civil society, organizations can realize these goods for everyone, here and globally, then that's fine. All the doctrine says is that should we find this difficult to achieve, I mean, we can make contributions, but should we realize that we can't do everything, then a higher authority, that is the state, or in the case of the universal common good, the community of nations, the national organizations, then they should step in. So I return the question. This is what the common good is about, making it possible for everyone to lead, to become fully human, to lead a flourishing life. And so that's what it's about. And I would say, let me not return the question, but answer it. I would say we cannot do that. Sorry. The churches can do a lot. We have food banks in the Netherlands as well. But, for example, the food banks, they can't feed everyone. They can't secure a minimum level, income level or whatever for everyone in the Netherlands, for immigrants that are coming into our country, people from Ukraine and so on. We can't do that. And so therefore, we need governments. We badly need governments. And then those governments ideally should be inspired by this same beautiful, I think, beautiful ideal.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for the folks who joined us on the live stream. Would you give our presenters another round of applause?